is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. Each year, the National Awards for Education Reporting names one beat reporter as the best in the country. The newest name to be added to this illustrious roster is Bianca Vázquez Toness of the Boston Globe. She was recognized for her outstanding work spotlighting abuses and systemic failures by public schools, as well as her thoughtful and nuanced reporting on vulnerable and underserved students. She joins us now. Bianca, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Thanks for having me, Emily.
I'd like to start with one of the stories in your award-winning package for the EWA Awards Ronald Moskowitz Prize for Beat Reporting, and that was about a 12-year-old struggling to learn remotely. How did you find Malaki solo?
I found it because, right as schools closed, we were curious about what everything would look like, right? I mean, we had no idea how all of this was going to work. I mean, no one had any idea, really. So I showed up at some food sites the first morning that schools were closed, looking to talk to parents or students. And he was there picking up food for himself and his brothers and sisters, and he was wearing his school uniform. And to me, it broke my heart to see him wearing his school uniform. It immediately told me that this is a child who wants to be at school, or at least feel like he still has a routine. So I approached him, and he was thoughtful and funny and willing to introduce me to his mother. And they lived around the corner, luckily. So he took me there.
How unusual is this? I mean, to find a profile subject in just this random way, but this is what's wonderful about journalism, isn't it?
It is. And this year, unfortunately, there are in some ways fewer random ways to meet people, because when schools were largely closed, we couldn't just go and wait outside the school and meet parents and meet students the way that we would have before. So these food sites, were really a good place, one of the only places to meet people.
What comes through in your story is this young man's intellectual curiosity, his humor, his loving and tender care of his family, including his younger siblings. And what I also thought comes through, though, is it shows how disparate the experience was for remote learning, not just for him, but among the classes that he's in within one school, and then the different experiences his siblings are having. It really was, within this one household, sort of a microcosm of what it was like to be a remote student in Boston this year.
That's right. I mean, he was such a fortunate find because he had siblings at 3 different schools. He was the 4th. And so we were able to compare all the different experiences. And this mother was on top of everything, right? So she was able, and she was sort of a critical consumer of, the communication and the services that the schools were offering. And she was comparing them all and thinking, what's happening for Malaki is not good enough. So, fortunately, we found a family with a lot of points of comparison that we could make, and a family who was open to sharing that with us.
You got very personal with this family. Was this a tough sell, or did they come on board right away to give you this kind of access? How did you build this relationship?
Well, we wrote about Malaki in just a quick one-day story. He was the lead in that story that was about food access and access to computers and this huge effort in Boston to try to get families and students what they needed to survive that week. Because at this point, I think we knew that it was going to be 5 weeks, a 5-week closure. So I wrote that story. I ran by all the details of the story with them before it published, and they, were willing to take photos. And so I think that those initial steps built trust. And then I came back to them a week later and said, hey, I noticed that your son really wants some semblance of order and routine. Can we just hang out and see if he gets it from his teachers, from his school? And they were incredibly willing. They would have allowed us in their home, but they had a daughter who had a fever at that time, and they didn't know yet if she was COVID positive. So that's why I decided to do it over Zoom and not go to their home.
I thought that lended obviously a very timely element to the story, but it was an interesting lens because you were, in a sense, having the same kind of limited experience that he was having.
It was really limiting. I mean, it was good for capturing what he was doing in school, good for capturing what was going on in his immediate environment. And it was a good way to see his home and introduce, meet other people in his home. But it wasn't a good way to interview him. It certainly wasn't a good way to form a good relationship with him necessarily.
I'm curious about your reporting process, back in, BC before COVID. Your stories really come to life with details that leap off the page or the screen, depending on how we're reading them. How are you capturing those moments and details? Are you a copious note taker? Do you talk to yourself on the ride home?
I am a copious note taker, and then I also just go back for more. Fortunately, I have the benefit of having time to write a lot of these stories, and so I've been able to just go back and ask more questions. There's that tension when you're interviewing someone. You don't want to break the flow of them telling a story or them, telling a story the way they want to tell it. And so I'm fairly respectful and let people tell a story the way they think it should be told, with all the details and Miranda, wanderings that they have, and then usually go back and ask later for more details.
Some people don't like to listen to themselves on those interview tapes, but for me, the worst moments were always when I realized I interrupted someone.
No, definitely. I try to do that as little as possible. And I guess maybe that is one advantage of having a background in radio. You don't interrupt people that much because you don't want it on tape, right? You don't want to ruin whatever they said unless you want that effect for some reason. But yeah, I try not to interrupt. I try to let people tell me what they want to tell me and then find ways to ask about, other more sensitive issues or the type of detail later. And also, you don't know necessarily what's going to be important when you're interviewing them the first time or the second time.
How much do you share with your sources before publication? I'm thinking about particularly parents. You write about a lot of very vulnerable children.
So I call up the parents and the student, depending on the age of the student, right? If it's a student over 18, I probably won't call their parents. Before it publishes, I'll tell them, okay, this is where it's publishing. It's going to be on the front page on a Sunday, which means it's going to be seen by a lot of people. And, your part in the story is going to appear in this place in the story, and hear the other people in the story. And then I'll go over, line by line, for the most part, what their part entails. And I'll read their quotes back to them.
So you're removing the element of surprise.
I remove the element of surprise. I don't think anyone, certainly not these children, should be surprised by seeing the paper or seeing themselves photographed in the paper or the way things play out. And I find that really helps. And maybe that's why that family, Malaki's family, talked to me, for the larger story, was because they'd already gone through this experience. And I think people appreciate it immensely to be given the chance to check facts and to know what's going to come out. And rarely do people take anything back.
I want to turn to another story in your award-winning beat reporting package, and that is one you broke on districts improperly forcing parents to sign away their children's legal rights to special education services during the pandemic. How did that land on your desk?
Complaints from parents and special education groups. They wrote to us. I mean, that was a situation where it literally did land on my desk. That was right in my inbox. Fortunately, a lot of people write to us with complaints. And this was one that seemed completely believable given what we were hearing anecdotally from parents about what they were getting and what they weren't getting in terms of services for their children with disabilities. So that one was in some ways just really presented to us in an easy, very clear-cut way. These are the districts that are doing this. Here are documents showing that they had parents sign these waivers. And it was just a matter of collecting, and talking to enough people in different districts to see how widespread it was.
I've noticed too, though, in your reporting that it's very rarely anything speculative. You back it up with the hard data and with the sourcing and the quotes.
Yeah, I think that no one's going to take this seriously if we don't do that, if we don't have enough parents on the record right, with their full names, if possible. And we don't have documents typically from, the schools, on their own letterhead. Yeah, no one's going to believe it otherwise. So, yeah, I think it's necessary.
What is your approach to building, a strong Rolodex of sources? We often tell new reporters to get out and put in the shoe leather. Obviously, that was different this year. But do you carve out time in your schedule automatically for that kind of outreach, or do you have time?
No, I wish I did. That would be really smart. I mean, I do try to keep in touch with people that I've met in the past or who have written in or have responded about, a story. I try to cultivate those people as much as I can. But as far as, for instance, when I wrote the story about the child welfare department in Massachusetts about mothers or fathers getting calls from schools, when their students weren't attending school, and usually it was mothers who would get the phone calls. I really had to build up a lot of sources for that story because I had never reported on DCF before. I had never reported on that issue. So I had to meet a lot of new lawyers and new parent groups. And I built that from the ground up for the most part.
Well, I think it's important for reporters to remember it's not cheating to go back and talk to people you've met before and say, hey, I'm working on this. Would you know someone I may want to talk to about it?
Oh, of course not. No. It's not cheating at all. It's really smart.
We're talking with Bianca Vázquez Toness of the Boston Globe, winner of the Ronald Moskowitz Prize for the nation's top education beat reporting. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you to everyone who has rated us on iTunes. Your support and feedback are helping us to grow. Bianca, what drew you to journalism in the first place? How'd you get into the profession?
I wrote my first story when I was in college. I had heard about this new type of menstrual device that I thought was going to revolutionize women's lives and reproductive health. And I felt like I absolutely had to write an article about it, which I did. And I unfortunately was then like forever linked with menstrual products on the internet for a long time. But I felt compelled to tell people things that I thought they should know. And I moved to Mexico after college and got a job at the English Language Daily at the time. It doesn't exist anymore. And I was writing about the informal economy in Mexico and lots of other, just things that fed my curiosity. And I started freelancing and started learning a lot about immigrants in Mexico who would leave from their poor communities in Mexico and go up to the US. These were villages or towns where, all the young people were gone, basically. And I got a job or got a sort of what I thought of as a real job in the US. And that's where I started covering education.
We've seen some great crossover reporting by folks who do both fantastic written work and fantastic radio work. And I'm wondering what skills you brought from radio work into your newspaper work and maybe a little vice versa.
I think that perhaps my focus on the voices of the people most affected by a story, I think that's probably what I bring from radio is there. I mean, it's all boiled down for the most part to the intimate voices of the people in your story. And that's what drew me to radio. That is probably what I bring over, an interest in narrative. But I think what I find in print that I really like is that ability to, which does exist in radio, but not necessarily in typical sort of short format news, is the ability to back up your story with lots of sources, documents, all the things that you need so that people will believe it and take it seriously.
So I've always argued that education is the best beat because it's the only one that lets you touch every other beat. And I'm wondering what keeps you on it.
I've had the experience of covering a lot of things. I mean, I've covered City Hall, I've covered immigration, I've covered things that I had to summon a lot of creative magical thinking to find an interest in. I wrote about telecoms in India. And it was hard to get excited about some of those things. So I come back to education because I'm just deeply interested in the welfare of children. And I don't have the same kind of passion for writing about the welfare of publicly traded companies. But children, and especially children who are disadvantaged, I find I care immensely about what happens to them. So that's why I keep coming back to it.
The Boston Globe is unusual in that it has multiple education reporters, and they've also been able to dedicate resources to special projects and series. One of them is called The Great Divide, and you recently collaborated with another reporter, Jenna Russell. You spent 9 months reporting on one class of immigrant students, and I strongly encourage everybody to go and read this. The detail, the nuance, and we talk about heartbreaking, but as you say in the story, there's a good chance that these very bright lights in these children's intellectual abilities are just not going to get to shine. And that was pretty hard to take. Tell us a little bit about how you approached that collaboration.
Well, Jenna is just absolutely fantastic. I would write every big story with her in the future if I could, because she's a wonderful, wonderful collaborator. There was a pretty kind of stark division of labor in some ways because I speak Spanish and she was working with a translator. So, I was able to, in the beginning, sort of stake out their classes and figure out who were the students that we, mostly needed to follow and which ones were going to, be the ones that might be worth really paying a lot of close attention to. And I mean, we had these conversations a lot, and she trusted me and my instincts about these students and the teacher and even which class to follow. So, I was really fortunate that she put a lot of trust in my ability to kind of suss out which students and which teacher and who would be worthwhile to spend time with. And so we divided the students up that way. She was an incredible sounding board. She was an incredible cheerleader, because this was a hard project. We didn't expect it to go on as long as it did. And things kept changing as well. School would happen, school didn't happen, school would happen again for these kids. I mean, it was just, there were so many ups and downs that seemed like they were going to change the direction of the story. And she hung in there with me, and it was fantastic to have her as a partner.
With the understanding that not every reporter, in fact, few reporters will get the opportunity to do that kind of deep embed project, what advice do you have for other education reporters who want to improve their approach to covering English language learners specifically?
I suppose finding real sort of cultural brokers to help you meet people and introduce you, people who are trusted, whether you speak their language or not, those cultural brokers are incredibly important. These students, I don't know if they would have talked to me if their teacher hadn't said to them, hey, talk to her. There's this journalist who wants to talk to you, talk to her. And so they did. And were quite open from the beginning, many of them, not all of them, but many of them. So I think that would be the first step, is find a trusted cultural broker. Of course, not everyone has someone trusted in their life. And unfortunately, some of the people who are the most vulnerable maybe don't have a teacher that they really trust, or another person. But maybe it's a church clergy member, or maybe it's, someone else in their community who might be able to connect you.
Is there anything you've learned to do during the pandemic that's going to stay in your reporter's toolbox? I mean, we're going to go back to life as usual in a lot of ways, but I'm wondering what might have changed in your professional practice.
If I needed to, I would Zoom with sources, and I probably wouldn't have done that before. For instance, if there was someone who didn't want to bring me into their home, right, because they're not supposed to live where they're living. This situation came up with someone I know. They didn't want to raise any suspicions by bringing a stranger into the apartment complex. I think Zoom would be a great way to, have them show me where they live, or what they do there, or what it's like to live there, or maybe, follow along on a normal day. I don't know if that would have occurred to me before the pandemic, but I would certainly do that. I think I text more with a lot more students and teachers than I did before, and parents. Because I think that we all have this sort of common experience now that we can talk about. I hope to continue doing that, to be in more sort of casual contact with sources than I was before.
We gave out the Moskowitz Prize online this year. The other two finalists were John Marcus of the Hechinger Report and Eliza Shapiro of the New York Times. Were you surprised when you heard your name?
Of course, definitely. I mean, those two people do wonderful work. John Marcus used to be my boss many years ago. So, it was quite surprising.
You didn't get a chance for an acceptance speech. Is there anything you'd like to say now?
I mean, I'm just so grateful that I've had the space and ability to write these stories, and so grateful that the Globe had the presence of mind before the pandemic to start this initiative. And I have a great job, and I've been really fortunate to have really supportive people around me.
Bianca Vázquez Toness is an education reporter at the Boston Globe and this year's Moskowitz Prize winner for the best beat reporting in the country. Bianca, thanks again for making time for EWA Radio.
Thanks for having me.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there is a story or a reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.